Hello, everyone, and a very warm welcome to this episode of The Federal. My name is Naved Anjum, and I'm joined today by a well known historian, Chitralekha Zutshi, who has written an illuminating biography of Sheikh Abdullah. It's called Sheikh Abdullah, The Caged Lion of Kashmir, which has been published by HarperCollins. And it is the second book in the Indian Life series, which is edited and curated by Ramachandra Guha, the well-known historian all of us know. Chitralekha, welcome to this episode of the Federal. It's an absolute pleasure to have you with us. We'll be talking about the book.
Thank you, Navid. Thank you so much for inviting me, and it's a privilege to be here really, to talk about the book.
Yes. So before we move on to the questions about the biography itself and the questions around Sheikh Abdullah, just a little bit for our audience about Chitralekha. Chitralekha, of course, is a well-known historian. Most of us have read her books. She is class of 1962 professor of history at William and Mary, Virginia. And her specialization is, of course, the history of South Asia and the Indian Ocean world. Her areas of expertise also include, nationalism, regional and religious identities and traditions, and she has written extensively, over nearly more than 3 decades. Some of her books include, of course, Languages of Belonging, Islam, Regional Identity, and The Making of Kashmir, Kashmir's Contested Pasts, Narratives, Sacred Geographies and the Historical Imagination, and Kashmir History, Politics and Representation. And the last, I think, 2019, it was Kashmir, Oxford, India, short introduction that you wrote about, Chitralekha. So just to begin this interview in earnest, Chitralekha, let's talk about this biography. It's a very necessary biography in the sense that there's not much available, and that's something you also write about in the introduction to the book. That how the paucity of material on his life, considering he did not come from that privileged background. We'll talk about all of that later, but the very fact that it's a result of your years of rigorous research on his life. Let's talk a little bit about what fascinated you about this figure who has not been written about so much.
Yeah, I started research and writing on Kashmir in the sort of mid to late 1990s. And I think in some senses, I've been writing this biography since then in my head. Because the first time I remember when I went to Kashmir to start research on my dissertation, which became my first book, you know, anywhere I went in Kashmir, to libraries, to university, and so on, people told me, there are 3 books you need to read, and then you'll know everything about the history of Kashmir. So the first one was Kalhana's Raj Tarangini. The second was Walter Lawrence's History of Kashmir, or Valley of Kashmir, which is published in the late 19th century. And the third is Sheikh Abdullah's autobiography, Atish-e-Chinar. Right? So they told me, here are 3 books, you read them, and you don't need to do any more research, right? So that was my first encounter with sort of Kashmir's history and researching Kashmir, and Sheikh Abdullah came up right front and center, from the first moment. Of course, my first book then is a much longer look at the development of identities and nationalism, in which Sheikh Abdullah figured quite prominently in the chapters on the 1930s and 40s. But I really began to think about writing a biography of him when I was working on my second book, which is called Kashmir's Contested Past, where I was really grappling with the idea of history itself and how it's been written about in Kashmir. Right? And the reason that Sheikh Abdullah sort of figured prominently in my thought process at that time was because his own legacy is so contested. And whenever I sort of did research on this topic of history and the past, he came up over and over again. And I realized at that time, and this was sort of in the second decade of this century, in the 2010s, that that he was such an important figure in the history of Kashmir, and yet he was so maligned, and this sort of this sort of feeling of Sheikh Abdullah is really important, but we really don't like him anymore, became deeper and deeper into the 20 teens, and then the later on, as I sort of started thinking about it. So it was really my second book where I said, he's such an important figure, but nobody's really done a well-rounded biography of him, right? But what I also wanted to do in this biography, and I hope I've succeeded in doing that, is to really bring him out from the region of Kashmir into the sort of history of the Indian subcontinent, and the really prominent role he played in shaping, some of the things that we live with today, like, federalism and secularism and, all of these ideas that have really shaped the Indian subcontinent. And he's not the only regional figure, obviously, that played an important role in defining these concepts, but he's one of the very important ones. And that was another reason why I felt that this biography really needed to be written, so that I could really do justice to this very significant figure, not just in the history of Kashmir, but also in the history of the subcontinent. It was, I mean, it has been quite a journey, for a number of reasons. I mean, this book has been a work of serious toil. I've toiled on it for a long time. So yeah, I'm very happy that it's finally out, and it can have a life of its own, and people can read it and learn, learn from it. So yeah.
Certainly. Considering there is going to be always that kind of interest with always a historical figure like this, and also you were talking about situating him in the larger context, and just I would add to it, the fact that you also tell his story in relation to the stories of many others in Kashmir,
Yes.
and in large and by and large, the many other historical figures who played such instrumental roles in the destiny of the nation, including people like Jawaharlal Nehru or Sardar Patel, and and those in Kashmir as well. The Raja, for instance, the Dogra Raja, and could you talk a little bit about that? That you did not want this to be just a story of Sheikh Abdullah, but also the story of people who sort of influenced him, shaped his politics, from whom he learned a lot.
Yes, and I sort of very deliberately made this choice of writing about Sheikh Abdullah as part of a larger generation of leaders of the 20th century, in South Asia, and in some ways in the world as well. I mean, you can find leaders like him everywhere, in the early 20th century, who are grappling with these ideas about how to reconcile their religious identity with their national identities, their regional identity with national identities, the relationship between a center and a region. So those, and then, I mean, Sheikh Abdullah himself was very influenced by sort of the larger global currents of communism and socialism and really sort of Islamic universalism and so on, right? So he was, and he wasn't much of a writer, and that was one of the difficulties I faced or challenges I faced as his biographer, because usually political leaders leave behind a large corpus of writing, and he hasn't left behind a large corpus of writing. So not only was it deliberate on my part, but it was also something that in some ways was forced upon me as well, because what I had to do is really look farther than him, to write the story of his life. And the way I did that was by looking at the people who surrounded him, but also sort of people farther afield, in the sense that press reports, for instance, people who were sort of writing about him, right? Or CIA intelligence sort of reports as well, who were sort of observing some of the things he was doing. So I got I got a very multifaceted picture of Sheikh Abdullah as a result. So it wasn't just something that was generated by him, but it was generated by these people around him, right? Who then he engaged with and that then changed him in very significant ways, right? So one of the one of the things about Sheikh Abdullah was that he was very aware of the image, his public image, right? I mean, most political leaders are, right? I mean, Gandhi, for instance, in India, he was very much concerned with his public image and tried to shape it. Sheikh Abdullah was very, very concerned with it as well, and was very active in presenting a narrative about himself, right? So in some ways, this biography is kind of this, you know, this narrative that I have written, but it's always grappling with these various narratives about Sheikh Abdullah, some of which he has shaped himself, some of which are being shaped by people around him, some of which are being shaped sort of globally in the press, whether it's the Indian press, the Pakistani press, the American press, the British press, so there's these various concentric circles within which, this biography has really been woven together. So yes, I mean, but then you specifically asked about the individuals. One of the things that I was interested in figuring out is, why is it that Sheikh Abdullah was the one who became sort of this spokesperson for Kashmir, right? Because there were some very, very charismatic, very sort of well-educated, young men, mostly, obviously, who could have had this mantle. And yet it was Sheikh Abdullah who sort of, succeeded in becoming and has this enduring image as being synonymous with Kashmir in some ways, right? Whether he's maligned or he's celebrated, or there's somewhere in between, you still, when you think Sheikh Abdullah, you think Kashmir, right? So how is it that he was able to embody this entire region and entire place? And this really intrigued me. And for that particular reason, I looked at the people around him to realize why he was the one who really rose to the top. In some ways, it was, because he came from this, and you mentioned this at the beginning of the interview, that he came from this very humble background, right? And he had very little to lose, I mean, many of the people are, many of the other Kashmiri political leaders, for instance, around him were, came from very prominent families. Their parents were involved in politics, or they themselves were involved. So, they had government positions, so they could never speak openly. Sheikh Abdullah was from a very modest background. He was charismatic. He was physically an imposing man. He was 6'4". I mean, he was large. And he had this powerful oratory, that he sort of carried out on these, from these various pulpits, and so everyone, and he represented sort of the coming of age of Kashmir in some ways, right? I mean, from this medieval servitude to modernity, right? So he embodied this, he came from a poor family and he was able to, rise to the top. So he, and he became a populist leader in many ways for that reason as well, because people could identify with him, right? Because they could see their own lives mirrored in his, in his life. And he used that, I mean, he talked about injustice, and he talked about, he talked about the suffering of the people in ways that really kind of, drew them to him. So I think that, to go back to your question, I was able to garner all this because I looked not just at his life, but at the lives of the people around him, right? And those who were interested in him, those who were his very close associates and friends, and then of course, national leaders like Nehru and Patel and so on, and then even sort of American leaders and British leaders and so on, who were involved in the Kashmir dispute in the early years and very interested in him for that reason as well. So again, told from sort of multiple perspectives, to bring out the complexities of this one flawed yet very compelling individual, sincere in some ways,
Absolutely.
Yeah.
You begin his story with, of course, the fact that he was born fatherless, and also
Right.
as a village boy who saw whose mother also died very early,
Right.
and this growing up with the seeing a lot of injustice and inequalities around
Yeah.
him, and suffering, of course. Do you think that also somewhere shaped his essential? I mean, we'll talk about how Lahore and Aligarh, that kind of shaped his political vision. But before that, the life that he saw around, did that also somewhere shape the young leader in him in some sense?
Yeah, you mean his early life and the injustice and so on? Is that
Yeah,
yeah.
Shura, the village in Shura, right?
The village
Sura.
in Saura, yeah, so, yes, absolutely. I mean, Saura, I think it
Mhm.
shaped his. I think his essential being and identity remained, in that. Not it wasn't a village. It was sort of this place in between the village and the city. And that was important because he was neither of the countryside nor of the city, and he was kind of in this um, middle position, right? And the suffering that he saw around him shaped him, but I think it was he also suffered personally from this deep inferiority complex as well. It was sort of this he had this sense that he wasn't as well educated or as well off as even the people around him in Kashmir, right? And so this sense, he was always trying to make up for that. So he was trying to make up for his own sense of, a sort of lack of selfhood. Because, I mean, think about the early 20th century in Kashmir, being a Kashmiri Muslim, but being a fatherless child as well, right? That I think had a very important role to play. He was essentially an orphan. I mean, his mother lived for a while, of course, but the fact that there wasn't a father figure in his life, I think, was very important. So he was always, I think, seeking some kind of father figure in his life. And Muhammad Iqbal, very early on in Lahore, became that father figure for him. And then there were many others. I mean, Nehru, in some ways, was also, Nehru was his friend, but he was also a little bit more than that. He really looked up to Nehru, as well. And there were many others, I mean, he was always kind of looking to cleave to someone, and there would always be and I've sort of, shaped the book in that way as well. There's always one figure, in every chapter that kind of stands out in his life, that he really is very, very close to, right? And towards the end of his life, all of those figures are gone, and he's a really, I mean, he dies a very sad and broken man, in part, of course, because he knows that his legacy is going to be contested, but also in part because, at a personal level, he feels like he's completely sort of, friendless and an orphan again, so the
Right.
beginning and the end of his life are kind of joined together in this sense of sort of, just fatherlessness, rootlessness. Um, and yet he was, of course, which is also why, of course, Sheikh Abdullah, in a sense, became the father of Kashmir, right? I mean, so he, the Baba-e-Qaum that he is. So he replaces all of these kind of voids that he has, in his personal life with Kashmir, right? So
Yeah.
Kashmir is not only his child, but in some ways also his parent, in kind of an odd way. So, um, it's everything for him. And what, you may say whatever you want about Sheikh Abdullah, he has, there are lots of issues and complexities and ambivalences and contradictions. But there was one thing that he was completely sincere about, and that was Kashmir. And he wanted the best for Kashmir and its people. And I think that's partly why he died such a broken man, because he knew that, he had failed, right,
Right.
in achieving that. So, but yes, I mean, most certainly his early life, I think, was always with him. Yeah.
Right. Now, this failure is also, lies at the root of how a lot of Kashmiris would, make of his life, in the sense that, that the very fact that, that he would be seen as somebody who sort of betrayed their dream in that sense, and somebody who could not actually, you know, achieve what he set out to, in the story of the self-determination. But also, I mean, you're talking about these dissonances and contradictions of his life. That was also to do with the large, the larger historical churn that was taking place, and the very fact that Nehru would not let, and not just Nehru but also Patel, and the fact that it was and continues to be an integral part of India, and that is a story that India wanted it to be that way. Um, I wanted to understand from you, if you could take us back a little back in time and start from his rise as a mass leader to his role as an administrator, in which he was not very successful, um, to to the later point of his life when, as I said, he remained a lonely figure, and with very few friends around him. Um, how do you see this story of failure, as part of the story of Sheikh Abdullah?
Well, you know, well, there are lots of intervening factors, if you will. I mean, this is not just a story of Sheikh Abdullah, right? I mean, that's the point that I've been making since the beginning. So,
Exactly. Yeah.
in part, I think he was a very successful, mass leader, but already at that moment itself, some of the sort of contradictions in the Kashmiri nationalist movement, for instance, its relationship with the Indian nationalism, all of those were sowed already in the 1930s and 40s and so on, right? So I think that some of the things that happened later were really a continuation of some of these cracks that, divisiveness that, Sheikh Abdullah, again, the major contradiction, or one of the major contradictions in his sort of political life, was the fact that he united the Kashmiris, but he did that by dividing them. If that's if that's not an oxymoron, right? So he very early on, for instance, took the Mirwaises, the head preachers of Kashmir, to task because he wanted to become the sole leader of the Kashmiri Muslims. And that meant that he had to kind of, really carry out this kind of, battle on the idea of Islam itself in Kashmir, and what it meant, and so on. And that again, early on, this divide between the valley and Jammu was laid out as well. Where for Sheikh Abdullah, when he thought of the Kashmir nation, he really meant the valley. And the Jammu Muslims were much closer to the Punjab, and the sort of Punjabi Muslim politics. Sheikh Abdullah, of course, was also with Muhammad Iqbal and so on. But by the late 1930s and early 1940s, he had broken off, not so much with Iqbal, but with the politics of the Punjab, or the politics of the Kashmir, of the Muslims of the Punjab, right? So he wanted to be independent and so on, and that led to a break with Jammu. So many of the sort of failures that you see later on creeping up were actually sort of sowed in the 1930s already, when he's a very popular mass figure, and that's one of the things that I've tried to point out in this biography, right? And then, of course, once Kashmir becomes, and the reason that Kashmir becomes in fact disputed is also a result of, in part, this divisions in the Kashmiri nationalist movement, right? And so once he takes over being the premier of Kashmir, right, with India's sort of blessing, then all of these sort of issues start coming up, right? And he is overtly, of course, pro-India, and very soon starts becoming sort of restive about the amount of autonomy that he has, right, to exercise within Kashmir itself. And the route that he takes is of repression. So he represses all views that are against him or against India at that point, and so on. And then, once his popularity begins to wane, then he starts becoming, sort of more anti-India to regain the popularity. That's when he's removed from office, right, through an internal coup. And then, the story is not really from there to an end. I think what the middle part of the story is, in fact, most interesting, right? When he's not a political figure at all, that he's a prisoner, I think that is the moment when Abdullah really kind of becomes a symbol of the dreams and aspirations of the Kashmiris, because he now represents sort of this person who's taking on India, right? So this reprise of his role as revolutionary is what really kind of cements in the minds of an entire generation of Kashmiris, right? This idea that he is going to fight for us, and he creates this image, right, of not just of himself but of the Kashmiri movement, right? Um, and that part of him, sort of as not an active figure in politics, is actually the most interesting to me. It was while I was writing this and researching it and so on, because you can see how behind the scenes he's really still trying to kind of assert himself. And then by the late 1960s, he realizes that his image in Kashmir is kind of on the wane, right? Again, well, in 1964 he's released, and then he goes to Pakistan and so on, which is also again a very crucial and important, interesting moment, right, where he is sort of presenting himself as a bridge between India and Pakistan, right? So he becomes sort of, this becomes a really important part of his philosophy, that I'm for Kashmiri self-determination, but more importantly, I'm for bridging this, divide between India and Pakistan. I'm going to bring these two countries together and so on. And then he fails in 1964, of course, in part, of course, because Nehru passes away when he's in Pakistan, and so and after that it sort of spirals down again, where he goes off for Hajj, and meets a lot of people there in Europe and the Middle East and so on, and comes back and is again shunted off to the south because he's met the Chinese premier and so on. And that's when sort of he starts. By then, of course, his old rivals, the Mirwais, have risen again in Kashmir. So the same sort of divides come up again, from the 1930s to the 1960s. And he realizes that he's an older man, and that he is being challenged by a much more assertive, radical, younger leadership, and that he has to make himself, important or significant again for Kashmiris, right? So that's when he starts working with India, hoping that there would be some way that he can come to a rapprochement with India and so on. And once he does that, of course, his image kind of really takes a severe knock, right? But he truly believed, I think, in 1975, when he came to this rapprochement with India, that he could, because the Kashmir administration was just steeped in corruption and nepotism, that he could actually at least clean things up, if nothing else. But then, of course, his own administration ended up becoming, the same. And then, if you look at the 1977 elections in Kashmir, those are the most interesting elections, because in those elections, Sheikh Abdullah becomes his old self again. He basically says, I'm for Article 370, I want, autonomy for Kashmir and so on. So in 2 years, he completely changes tack and starts taking on the center again. But,
and those were, of course, he has had this very, his relations with the center was constantly, he would have this strained relationship with Nehru also. I think there's a crucial chapter in the book that you write about, the year between 1951 to 53. And if you could talk a little bit about that how sort of, these, that also later, and that then we can come to that elections of 1974 and how that's sort of
77,
also,
right? Yeah, I mean, 1951 to 53 is the most crucial moment in some ways, because I that's the hinge here, right? It's the moment that really kind of turns his life, right? His political life turns on. That's the pivot in some ways, because that's when so up to about 1950 he's still pro-India, at least publicly and so on. But by 1951 he started kind of not so much becoming anti-India, but just realizing that maybe maybe being a part of India is not the best thing for Kashmir or Kashmiris. It's not the autonomy that he had thought of, and so on. So he starts giving these interviews saying that, Kashmir can be autonomous. Um, and there are these little ways in which he starts expressing sort of his discontent, right, with the relationship between India and between Kashmir and India. And um, and at that time, of course, because of some of his repressive policies and so on, in Jammu, of course, you have the Praja Parishad movement that emerges, um, that says, one flag, one constitution, one prime minister, and so on. And he is really unwilling to engage with that, right? And recognize that the people of Jammu have genuine grievances, right? So he just labels them. And again, this idea of communal and secular becomes sort of, he says, I'm secular, these people are communal, right? So he deploys this kind of, communal card to tarnish them. And of course, they were of course being supported by the Hindu right wing and so on. So that, it wasn't that far-fetched of a thought. I mean, it was true in a sense, but also it was based on, the genuine grievances that people in Jammu had. But in general, with Sheikh Abdullah, and Nehru had a role to play in this as well. They never allowed an opposition to emerge in Kashmir, right? So if there had been a healthy space for an opposition, various opposition parties, then, the politics wouldn't have become so one-sided and divisive, right? But because that space was not allowed to exist, right? Because Nehru was so concerned that Sheikh Abdullah should be the one in power. Because if there was a plebiscite, then he would deliver Kashmir to India, right? That's what he had always told Nehru and Patel and so on. So they never allowed anyone else to sort of challenge him, right? And as a result, all of the opposition to Sheikh Abdullah went into this Praja Parishad movement. So there was, all sorts of people who had trouble with Abdullah, sort of flocked to this particular movement, and which basically was undermining his authority, right? So, and his response was, I'm right, they're wrong. And so again, it sort of became irreconcilable, early on. And his administration sort of, failed in that way. But, his administration was also very successful in, for instance, drawing out the land reforms, right, for which he is still remembered. But the land reforms themselves kind of dispossessed a number of Hindus from Jammu, right? And so that was another reason why they were in the Praja Parishad movement. And so, once that starts to happen, Sheikh Abdullah's back is against the wall, or at least he feels like his back is against the wall and he can't really maneuver. Nehru tries really hard to get the Praja Parishad leaders to kind of, tone down their rhetoric and stop attacking him. But he's unsuccessful, and Sheikh Abdullah sort of, increasingly feels isolated, right? He feels like his best friend and his confidant and his supporter Nehru is not really doing enough. He feels attacked and so on. So he ratchets up his rhetoric even more. Meanwhile, Kashmiri Muslims are also kind of moving away from him because they feel like he hasn't done anything for them. He hasn't really lived up to his promises and so on. So he's caught in between sort of, these various, he's caught in a bind essentially between a rock and a hard place. He doesn't know what to do. And he ratchets up his rhetoric and then it becomes kind of untenable for, Nehru to keep supporting him because, he keeps telling him, come to Delhi, we'll have a chat and, we can work this out. And Abdullah keeps saying there's nothing left to talk about. We've talked about it, ad nauseum, and we haven't been able to resolve our differences. So there's this kind of, in some ways, not so much a misunderstanding, but just lack of communication, not, and not for lack of trying, at least on Nehru's part. I mean, Nehru's, I've gone through his post 1947 papers and he wrote, he was really trying very hard. But Abdullah, again, as I said, felt cornered by this time, and it was, becoming sort of difficult for him. People around him as well, and this is where the people, sort of his colleagues and so on, become important, because they were becoming tired of him as well, right? So the National Conference leadership was tired of him, I think,
Right.
and felt that it was sort of, there was no point. Some of the things that he was saying, they were, sort of pointless and such. So I think at that moment, his sort of fate was sealed. There was this sort of internal coup, right, that was carried out. And of course, Nehru was aware that he was going to be removed from office, but he was not either aware or certainly did not support his arrest, right? It was really Bakshi who, felt that if Abdullah was kept out of prison, then he would, again, the same problem, right? He would be an opposition figure who would challenge Bakshi. And in Kashmir, you had no opposition. You had one leader, and that's it. An opposition has never been allowed to emerge in that place, right? So, and yeah, so he was gone. But as I said, I mean, 1953 in some ways was a boon to Abdullah, because he came back as a sort of revolutionary figure, something that he had kind of lost. His image had become tarnished while he was prime minister, and now he was able to reclaim that image after
Right.
1953. So,
Right, but the successive I mean, after that, the political space that was created after him, and in which his own son and grandson had a role to play, that also did not do, as far as I can see, no good to his legacy, in the sense that uh, you know in many ways, in fact. So. Farooq Abdullah, for instance, you know, at that point of time, also he has his own. There are stories of, you know,
right.
of failures there also. So, and then his grandson, that is. But more than being an engaging and objective biography, it's also one which addresses a lacuna, Chitralekha, and that is that's something that you also write about in the introduction. That is, these regional leaders, and
Right.
how these major national leaders overshadow their. I mean, in terms of when it comes to writing their biographies. I
Right.
mean, you have biographies of Nehru and Gandhi, but not so many of regional leaders like Abdullah, or,
Right.
for instance, E.S. Namboodiripad, as uh, you know. Uh, 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 is there. I mean, there's so many other regional leaders also whose biographies have
Yes.
not
Yes.
not written about. So, if you could talk a little bit about that, in the context of the South Asia, that is.
Yeah. I think that in general, and Ram Guha has written about this, of course, that in general, sort of, South Asian, historians of South Asia don't really write biographies very much, right? And now, of course, that is changing a little bit, in part because of the Indian Life series, but in general as well. But they still kind of go to these major figures, right, like Nehru and Ambedkar and Patel and so on. And there are so many other sort of, not just regional leaders, but sort of, leaders of the second or third tier that, we don't consider sort of these big national figures, right? Who played a very, very important role, right? In shaping the history of the subcontinent. And Sheikh Abdullah was certainly one of them, is one of them. So yes, I mean, but even, in terms of Sheikh Abdullah himself, there are very few biographies of him as well, right? That was one of them. There's Ajit Bhattacharyaji's, Sheikh Abdullah, Tragic Hero of Kashmir, and then more recently there's Altaf Hussain Para's biography as well. But again, as I said, what I wanted to do is write about Sheikh Abdullah in the context of Kashmir, but in the context of, but also in the context of the subcontinent, and in the context of the people who surrounded him and those who were his interlocutors and colleagues, friends, and so on. So,
And
yeah.
also as a chronicle of the socio cultural,
Right.
strands in the book. There's so much to, sort of get a sense of that era in that.
Right. And writing about Sheikh Abdullah made me realize, or look at even these national figures like Nehru in a new light, right? Because
Yeah,
and the early years of the Indian Republic in a new light, right? Because uh, even as a historian of Kashmir, before I wrote this biography, I used to wonder, why didn't Nehru just stop the Praja Parishad agitation, right, or something like that? And then I realized that there was a much larger group of not just people, but a much larger bureaucracy that was at play here, right? That prevented Nehru from, I mean, yeah, it was, India was not just sort of this, one man sort of, republic. I mean, there were, others. There was a very strident opposition. There were, people who were challenging Nehru's ideas, right? And the Praja Parishad agitation was a way for the Hindu right to challenge the Nehruvian idea of India, right? Very early on. And Abdullah, of course, became the target because he was an embodiment of this, um,
Mhm.
some of these contradictions, right? So I think that it really, and I hope that the book is able to do that for other readers as well. Make them think about the shaping of India itself
Absolutely.
through this one sort of regional figure in a new way. Yeah. So
So, in the final analysis, Chitralekha, if we talk about the life and legacy of Sheikh Abdullah, uh, just to sum things up, I mean, we see him as a person who's torn between between his secularism and his larger base in Kashmir,
right,
which has to do with religion, of course, and it's to the extent of maybe fundamentalism, but and also somebody who was seen as perhaps as somebody who opposed the two nation theory of Jinnah's two nation
right,
theory. He was also seen as somebody who was, I mean, he of course remained very very close to the Indian leaders, but there was this sense of distrust, from Pakistan as well, that he was not. Uh, he is seen as somebody who was a collaborator with the Indian government. So, how in the final analysis, how would you see, how would you sum up, the life and legacy of Sheikh Abdullah, and on that you would find that.
well, I think that Sheikh Abdullah was really good at, when he was successful in doing this, of course, really good at reconciling his sort of, his Muslim identity with his secularism, and he was truly secular, and he wanted Kashmir to be a homeland for not just Muslims, but for, Hindus and Sikhs and so on as well. And I think that's why he saw in Nehru a kindred spirit. He felt that this was, and not in Jinnah, right? I mean, because he felt that Jinnah, not only was he focused too much on the politics of Muslims, but he also felt that the Muslim League movement was too feudal, right? And he wanted sort of this, socialist utopia to be created in Kashmir. So he truly believed these things, right? So as I say towards the end of the book, in the epilogue, that he was a Muslim secularist with a dash of sort of socialism thrown in, um, and and um, and believed that he could, you know, bring freedom for Kashmir and Kashmiris within the framework of India, right? So he truly believed this, I think, until quite late. I mean, in the 1940s and even maybe the early 1950s, he truly, I mean, that's what he was pushing to. He, of course, did not seem to realize that, India was this, a republic in the making, and it was federal in character, but it wasn't so federal that it would allow autonomy to Kashmir, especially since Kashmir was disputed with Pakistan, right? And so he kept kind of pushing for that and not getting really very far, right? But um, one of the things he was able to do successfully that his successors could not was to to reconcile this Muslim identity within a sort of composite Indian nationalism. I mean, he really could do that. His successors couldn't, so they went to either sort of extreme anti-Indian sort of and which is why people like Balraj Puri, for instance, would keep telling Nehru that, and even Indira Gandhi, they told that Sheikh Abdullah is the only one who can keep this generation of Kashmiris from becoming completely pro-Pakistan and becoming extremist and so on. Because even though he is Muslim and he's very proud of being a Muslim, he still believes in this kind of idea of secularism. He did. I mean, till the very, very end, I think he truly believed that it was possible to be both Muslim and secular, right? And I mean, he obviously failed to convince not only his constituents but also Indians and Pakistani. So he kind of died in this space where he was just misunderstood by everyone, right? So through the course of his life, of course, he was celebrated in India at one point. Then he was persona non grata in Pakistan. He was, a mass leader of mass Muslim, leader of the masses in Kashmir. Then he becomes a hero in Pakistan, but a traitor in India. Then he's of course a hero to Kashmiris, and then he's a traitor in Kashmir. So he's constantly in between these kind of but I think I would say in the final analysis that he really wanted to be able to say that I'm Muslim, I'm proudly Muslim, right? But I'm also, a proud Kashmiri, and I want to be part of India, right? I mean, in the sense of, he never called himself Indian, by the way, so, which much to the chagrin of many of his detractors, right? Because they said, why doesn't he just say he's Indian? And he said, I'm Kashmiri and I will lay down my life for the freedom of India, but I'm Kashmiri, so he was Kashmiri Muslim first and last. I mean, that was what he that was sort of the hill he was willing to kind of lay down his life for, right?
Right.
And this is the thing about him, because he was so deeply rooted in Kashmir, and this goes back to your original question about his early influences. He was so deeply rooted in Kashmir that he could never conceive of himself as being a leader of Indian Muslims, right? Because this was something that was asked of him, that why don't you in that way you can become more integrated into India when he was in prison and so on. And he said, I really don't have anything much to say to the Muslims of India, because my heart and my soul and my body, everything is rooted in Kashmir, and that's what I understand. And maybe if that is resolved, then I can think about he also, of course, felt that Indian Muslims suffered from a minority complex, right? And he felt, Kashmiri Muslims were in a majority. They don't have any of these issues, right? I mean, so he was, this interesting way in which this minority majority issue was kind of playing out in his in his political life. So yeah, he and the caged lion of the title he's caged, of course, because he was in prison, but he's also metaphorically caged. Sheikh Abdullah could never move beyond the Kashmir Valley in Kashmir, and have a much larger vision, for himself, which he could have. I mean, there were several opportunities in his political life, and he could have, very easily become, but then he was so scared of obsolescence. He was like, I don't want to become like Maulana Azad in independent India, where he was one of the leaders. Nobody really, thought of him as being important to Muslims. And I still want to be important to Kashmiri Muslims. So if I go off to India, become a leader there, what's going to happen to my base in Kashmir? So he was always very concerned about his own constituency. And in some ways, he was just, he was caged by that, this narrowness of his vision, and that kept him from achieving perhaps, his true potential as a leader. But then that's what makes him Sheikh Abdullah, I think, because he was of Kashmir, and he remained of Kashmir.
So, do you think this larger this constituency of that sort of turned against him after the accord, or how did that sort of influence his perception of in Kashmir, in fact?
How did that influence his perception of Kashmir,
In,
or the perception of
in,
Kashmiris of
in
him?
Kashmir, like by the Kashmiris, in
Yeah, the accord, the accord really tarnished his image. I mean, there's no question about it. And he realized that as soon as he had signed the accord and come back to Kashmir, right? Which is why, and this we go back to the 1977 elections, he tried to take it all back, right? And say that, and basically ran on an anti-center, anti-India, pro Article 370 ticket, and um, and really kind of fed this generation of young Kashmiris on this very extremist rhetoric, right?
Hmm.
And once and then he, of course, the National Conference won, right, against the Janata coalition, in which every other leader, by the way, that had been his colleague and friend had joined, right, in 1977. They were all against him because they were like, they were like, the time has come for Sheikh Abdullah to get out of here, because none of those people were for the accord. They thought the accord was a sham. It was just window dressing to show that, um, India was giving Kashmir some autonomy, and it was not the case, right? So none of the issues that Kashmiris had always been fighting for had been addressed in the accord. So everyone was against him. So in 1977, he kind of, again, went for his base. He always, whenever he felt embattled, he went for his base, and he did a superb job of it, really, where the NC was fielding basically, unlettered folk nobody had heard of. They were unnamed people, and they all won. And they won because, even those who were against him came out to vote for the national conference because of some of the rhetoric, right? And once he came to power in 1977, there was Shamim, who was a journalist, and he was an MP from Kashmir as well. But by then he had become a journalist, and he wrote and said that, this is the moment. This is the moment for Sheikh Abdullah to step back and say, I'm not going to be the chief minister. I'm going to do something else. I'm going to just play an advisory role, and that will, keep his image intact and so on. And he chose not to. He became the chief minister. And as Ahmad Shamim had pointed out, what happened to those youth that he had fed on this extremist rhetoric? They were left hanging, right? So between 77 and 82, when he died, he kept poking at the center to regain that image of himself, but he was never able to, right? And what he left, the legacy he left for his future generations, not just of his own family, but anyone in Kashmir, was these contradictions, right, of unresolved sense of sort of irresolution of this, issue of Kashmiri nationalism, right? So, and again, even though it was not just his fault, right? I mean, some of the things that he ended up having to do were because he was in war with the center, and there were all these other exigencies that forced him. But it is his legacy that we are living with, in very significant ways, right? So, yeah.
And it is the prism through which we'll continue to see the Kashmir story.
Yes.
Well, on that
Yes.
note, Chitralekha, thank you so much for talking to us. It's a valuable biography, and I'm sure those of us who are not just those who are interested in the story of Kashmir or in India, but also those interested in the story of South Asia per se, would be would buy this book, read it, and they will be enriched from the story of an individual, remarkable in so many ways, and the rigorous research that shows through on every page. Thank you so much.
Subscribe to the Federal's YouTube page for more news and updates.